Many people know John Updike for his short stories and novels, but he actually got his start in poetry, and he wrote some pretty good ones at that. Today, we're going to be looking at one of his best. Welcome to a reading, summary, and analysis of John Updike's Ex-Basketball Player. Pearl Avenue runs past the high school lot, bends with the trolley tracks and stops, cut off before it has a chance to go 2 blocks at Colonel McComsky's Plaza. Berth's garage is on the corner facing west, and there, most days, you'll find Flick Webb, who helps Berth out. Flick stands tall among the idiot pumps, 5 on a side, the old bubblehead style, the rubber elbows hanging loose and low. One's nostrils are 2 S's, and with his eyes an E and O, and one is squat, without a head at all, more of a football type. Once, Flick played for the high school team, the Wizards. He was good, in fact, the best. In '46, he bucketed 390 points, a county record still. The ball loved Flick. I saw him rack up 38 or 40 in one home game. His hands were like wild birds. He never learned a trade, he just sells gas, checks oil, and changes flats. Once in a while, as a gag, he dribbles an inner tube, but most of us remember anyway. His hands are fine and nervous on the lug wrench. It makes no difference to the lug wrench, though. Off work, he hangs around May's luncheonette. Greasy gray and kind of coiled, he plays pinball, smokes those thin cigars, nurses lemon phosphates. Flick seldom says a word to May, just nods beyond her face toward bright, applauding tiers of Necco wafers, nibs, and juju beads. Okay, so I want to backtrack and look at the first 2 stanzas here. And in the first stanza, we obviously have the setting being established, but if you dig a little bit deeper into it, I want to talk about some of the symbolism that we see with Pearl Avenue here. We notice that the garage that Flick works in is on a dead end. It's cut off before it has a chance to go any further. Also, it faces west, and it's worthwhile noting that in American culture, westward is ubiquitous with expansion, thanks to, Manifest Destiny and some racism and stuff. But anyway, when we're talking about facing west, there is definitely an expansion, a going further, an advancement to it, if you will, in American culture. So there's some interesting symbolism with that you're probably picking up on, that the street stops and it faces west, but it can't go any further west. And likewise, Flick's life seems to have been cut off right past the high school lot. Doesn't get much further than that. So after we're introduced to Flick, we get this description of him at his job. And this personification that we see in yellow here of the gas pumps is just so interesting to me. We get some sports imagery, right? There's 5 on a side, which is, of course, basketball. And then there's one pump that's squat without a head at all, more of a football type. And again, that's something you'll hear people describe, like if a basketball player is kind of squat or a little bit shorter, they might say they're more of a football type build as opposed to a basketball. Doesn't mean they can't play basketball, right? They're on this side. So it's interesting because Flick doesn't have teammates anymore. He has gas pumps. And if you remember the ending of the poem, it talks about the speaker seeing Flick play basketball in '47. So you have to remember that these are old gas pumps, and here's some photos of them. They don't look anything really like our modern gas pumps. So you could see how they might resemble basketball players with how tall they are and their rubber elbows. Okay, in the next 2 stanzas, I want to point out the speaker. So we get this really personal speaker. We don't have any name for him or her, but it's someone who knows Flick personally. It's almost like someone representing the town that Flick is in. And I like how in the first stanza, the speaker saw him rack up 30 or 40 in one home game. This person remembers watching Flick play basketball. That's how memorable it was when he played. But in the second stanza, it's just a memory, right? Most of us remember anyway as Flick dribbles an inner tube for a tire as a gag, but it's like, well, we all remember he can play basketball, right? It's just kind of sad that instead of dribbling a basketball, he's now dribbling an inner tube to kind of show off as a bit of a gag. Another thing worth pointing out between these 2 stanzas is this mirrored image we have here of Flick and his hands. In the first stanza, it says the ball loved Flick. And if you've ever played sports or watched sports, I guess, you'll know what that person's talking about here. When someone's so good at a sport, it's almost like the ball always goes to them. You see this with like basketball or soccer or football or volleyball, I suppose. Any sport that, has a ball or an object that people follow. And it's not that the ball loves them, it's just that that person is so instinctful at reading the game that they know exactly where to be, and they pounce on every opportunity. So it's like the ball is always going to them. And we see this description of Flick with the ball. His hands are like wild birds, that they're just like taking off in all sorts of different places, always grabbing the ball. He's a phenomenal basketball player. In the next stanza, though, his hands are still talented, fine, and nervous, but they're on a lug wrench now. And that doesn't make any difference to the lug wrench. Because a lug wrench, unlike a basketball, doesn't require a lot of finesse. It's more of a brute force type of tool to remove a lug nut from a tire. So Flick's hands are the same, but instead of a basketball, he has a lug wrench. In stanza 2, instead of teammates, he has gas pumps. And then in our final stanza here, I want to talk about what's going on outside of work. And I put a pretty lengthy little paragraph in there, but I think this is really important to point out. There is nothing wrong with working in a gas station, right? Like if your job is fulfilling or helps make someone else's life better or easier in any little way, then like that's an honorable profession. So there's nothing wrong with working in a gas station. But Flick doesn't find this work fulfilling. And again, there's nothing wrong with work that's not necessarily fulfilling, because sometimes you just have to do a job to get by or provide for your family or whatever. But Flick doesn't even really have that. Once he's done, he just goes to May's luncheonette every day and kind of wastes the day away. And this is someone who knew dedication and practice. You don't get to the level that Flick was at on the basketball court purely on natural talent. You have to put in the hours and the practice. But now, instead of practicing with his teammates or, perfecting his jump shot, he's smoking thin cigars and playing pinball. And I guess drinking lemon drinks as well. So you get this really sort of sad feeling at the end of this stanza. And in addition to this outside of work theme, there's also a really interesting metaphor. It's one of my favorite metaphors in all of poetry, actually. So I have another video where I talk about similes and metaphors and other types of comparisons. And I'm actually going to jump over to that video real quick and play for you the explanation of this stanza, because I actually used this metaphor as my prime example of a great metaphor. The example we have here demonstrates one of my favorite things about metaphors, and that's that they don't have to be completely within a poem. So if we go back to Robert Burns' Love, Red Rose, they're both right there in the same line. It's not really that hard to find that comparison if you see the word like, and you know in your mind like simile. Whereas a metaphor can be trickier to find. So let's look at this one. This comes from the end of the John Updike poem, Ex-Basketball Player. Wonderful poem. And I didn't give you the whole poem here, but basically Flick was this star basketball player, and now he works at a convenience store gas station. Nothing wrong with that line of profession, but he still kind of only sees himself as a basketball player. And it's really a poem about how he kind of peaked in high school and was never able to live up to his potential on the court in other areas of his life. So end of the poem here. Flick seldom says a word to May, just nods beyond her face toward bright applauding tears of Necco wafers, nibs, and juju beads. So this poem's from the 50s, so the candy is a little antiquated, but you can still find Necco wafers. I don't know about the other two, but you can find them at the grocery store, usually very, very bottom. Taste a little different, but they remind me of my old relatives in Pennsylvania, so sometimes I buy them for nostalgia's sake. So anyway, what's the metaphor here? Well, you only get half the comparison, and that's what makes it tricky. Flick is walking into a convenience store where he works, and he doesn't say a word to the person he works with or maybe works for, May. Just nods beyond her face toward bright applauding tears of Necco wafers, nibs, and juju beads, which are candy, as we talked about. So this can be a hard metaphor to find unless you notice that there are some words that are out of place, and this is where poetry lying to us comes into play, because candy does not applaud us. When you think about that sentence, bright describes candy and tiers being arranged in rows that are progressively going up, so you can see all the candy and it's at eye level and easier to pick which one you want as opposed to it just being thrown into a bin. Those make sense, but the applauding doesn't. That's a lie. However, in that little lie, we can figure out the metaphor and thus discern some more meaning from this poem, because the candy is being compared to something else. And if you remember that the title of the poem is Ex-Basketball Player, you might be able to figure out what that something else is. So did you guess something else that is in bright rows and applauds basketball players? That candy is being compared to a crowd at a basketball game, the fans. And it really drives home this sad reality of Flick's life, that once he was adored by fans, and now the only thing applauding him in his life is candy. It's kind of a bummer, but it's a wonderful metaphor. So when you see that transformation of someone who used to enjoy rows of people applauding and cheering him, and now he just sees bright candy almost mocking him from across the luncheonette, it's quite a sad poem. And I often wonder, what is Updike getting at here? It's not that he has to have a moral to his poem, because, that's not the point of literature. Some literature has morals, but not all literature. They don't always have a meaning or a moral. And it's not like Flick has necessarily done something wrong, or at least he couldn't play high school basketball forever. And had he gone to college, well, he would have had 4 more years of basketball, but then he might be in the very same scenario. And even if he would have gone pro, he still might be in the same scenario, right? Like, the life of an athlete is pretty short. You're done being an athlete pretty early on in life and facing your limitations very early on. So what was Flick to do? Well, I think there's something to be said about the fact that he never learns a trade, and maybe he didn't explore other areas of interest. And now that basketball's been taken away because he's run his course with it, he feels lost. And I myself did sports my entire childhood through college. And that feeling of never being on a team again, even though there's still races and adult leagues and all sorts of stuff you can do as an adult, you never get that feeling of being on a team again. Even as a coach, I coach some sports now, it's still not the same thing, right? And it's just kind of sad when it's all done. And I think Updike really plays into this very well, and as someone who grew up in a small Pennsylvania town, he must have seen people like Flick, people who were on top of the world in high school and then just didn't know where to go. So maybe it's a poem about being well-rounded, like it's a warning. We watch this happen to Flick so we don't have to watch it happen to us. Or maybe it's just eye-opening to think, even if you're the town hero, doesn't always mean everything's perfect. That we're all human and we all have our struggles. And maybe we should see each other like that and try and be understanding of them. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe. I do other videos on poems and essays and short stories and novels and plays and all sorts of sometimes random stuff, but usually connected to literature in some way or another. So if you found it useful, if you wouldn't mind liking it and subscribing, it would greatly help me out. But in all honesty, just thank you for making it to the end of the video. I appreciate it. So have a good one. Happy reading. And if you have a question about the poem or a suggestion or a new idea, I'd love to read about it in the comment below. Have a good one.